Morning folks, and welcome to today's episode called Alex Karp of Palantir, the Philosopher CEO who never doubts. And Karp is, I would say without question, one of the most unlikely, one of the most outspoken, and definitely one of the most polarizing CEOs in the business world at the moment. He's this hyperactive, self-proclaimed neo-Marxist. He says he's a progressive, a liberal, and he built Palantir, a software company involved in some of the most controversial government projects of the past 2 decades. I mean, that includes working with ICE, defense contracts with the Pentagon and the CIA, working with Israel, at the same time helping Ukraine hold off a Russian invasion, and supporting governments around the world during COVID. And all the while he built Palantir from like zero into a company that today is worth $375 billion. This isn't a simple story, but it is a fascinating one. So Alex Karp, born in 1967 in New York City, but his family moved to Philadelphia when he was young. His father Robert is a Jewish pediatrician, and his mother Leah was an African-American artist, and both were very progressive activists. They went on marches and brought young Alex along to protest, labour rights, civil rights, and this shaped Karp's thinking and really everything about who he is today, because he continues to be a very, very passionate and vocal speaker and really puts his thoughts and his beliefs out there in the public very, very clearly. Karp grew up with severe dyslexia, which he said forced him to think differently, and he also had ADHD, and he managed that by taking up Tai Chi, and he continues to practice Tai Chi obsessively to this day. He went to a highly selective public school in Philadelphia where he excelled in debating, and he gravitated towards social theory. And it's obvious in every interview since that he is a very, very, I would say, ferocious and skilled debater. Next, he studied philosophy at Harvard and became fixated on power and how societies actually organise themselves. And that curiosity then pushed him towards Stanford Law School. But he hated it. He later called it the worst 3 years of my adult life. But the good thing that came out of Stanford for Karp was his lifelong friendship with Peter Thiel. And man, I really can't wait to cover Thiel on this show. It'll have to be, I would say, at least a 3-parter, maybe even a 4 or 5-parter, because love him or loathe him, Thiel has had a huge impact and influence on the last 30 years of the business world. And just like Thiel's friendship with Reid Hoffman, also at Stanford, on paper, Thiel and Karp, they had no business being friends. Karp is a socialist. Thiel is an arch-libertarian. And most of the campus left-wing people, they wanted nothing to do with Thiel. But according to Karp, we argued like feral animals. And so they built their friendship on this constant debate. After graduating in 1992, Karp went to Germany to begin a PhD at Goethe University in Frankfurt, and while working on his PhD he stayed on as a research associate. But then in 1998 he inherited a very small amount of money from his grandfather. It's said that it's $12,000, and he began investing it and found that he was good at it. According to Karp, word spread that this crazy dude was good at investing, and soon some high net worth individuals were asking him to manage their money. So he moved to London and opened up a small investment firm, and that kind of funded his academic studies. By 2002, Karp had finished his PhD, and the central argument of his thesis was that aggression isn't something society suppress, it's something that they rely on to hold it together. And he was also skeptical of the language of political correctness. He saw it as moralized jargon that masks power and resentment. And this thesis, it's important because it shaped Karp's thinking, and that thinking that he brought with him into Palantir. Basically, that institutions don't survive on good intentions alone, and that sometimes they need forceful tools to defend what they're built on. Now, he closed his small investment firm in London, and not because it wasn't successful, but because it was never meant to be a vocation. It had basically done what it was meant to do. It allowed him to earn money while he completed his thesis. And in 2002, he moved to San Francisco, took a job with the Jewish Philanthropy Partnership as a fundraiser, and he turned out to be very good at it. He understood how to talk to wealthy donors, how to frame ideas, how to get people to write large checks. Now, at the same time, he began spending more time with Peter Thiel. And the September 11 attacks had shaken Thiel, and he was exploring ways that might prevent, a future attack, because he saw that the attacks weren't just an intelligence failure. They were a data failure. The US agencies, they had fragments of information on the hijackers, but the data, it sat in silos. It was unconnected, unanalyzed. And Thiel had seen this problem before. At PayPal, the company had nearly collapsed under a wave of very sophisticated fraud, much of it coming from Russia. And the losses, they were so severe that PayPal, it had been on the verge of closing. And the solution was software they developed in-house. A system that trawled through vast amounts of transaction data, detected patterns, and flagged the bad actors before the damage was done. So Thiel's insight was simple. What worked for fraud might also work for terrorism. So in May 2003, he incorporated Palantir Technologies, named after Lord of the Rings Seeing Stones, and he bankrolled a prototype with 3 founding engineers. But they needed a CEO. At first, they looked for someone with military credentials, Washington connections, operational gravitas. But none of the candidates impressed, so Thiel turned to Karp. Now, on the face of it, Karp isn't what you'd consider CEO material. He's got this long, crazy corkscrew hair. He's obsessed with philosophy. He speaks German for nearly half of every day. He has no technical background, but he could grasp complex systems fast and, crucially, explain them to people who weren't engineers. And Palantir also, and this is very important, it fit in with his worldview that liberal democracies need better tools to defend themselves against authoritarian powers. So when Karp decided to join as CEO, Palantir wasn't framed as a startup. It was framed as a mission. And as Karp put it, they were building the most important company in the world. Now, in terms of investment, Thiel put in about $2 million initially, although over time this would increase to over $30 million. And Thiel, he also used the connections he'd made through PayPal to get them in front of some of the top Silicon Valley VCs. But they weren't interested because selling technology to government was viewed as a graveyard for startups because you have slow procurement cycles. You also have an awful lot of toxic politics around the war on terror. Nobody wanted to touch it, except, of course, the government. And so in June 2004, Palantir got $2 million from In-Q-Tel. I'd never heard of this. In-Q-Tel is the venture arm of the CIA. It was set up in 1999 and it invests in technologies the intelligence community might one day need. So it's no surprise then that the following year, the CIA became Palantir's first major customer. They developed a prototype and it was deployed to analyse insurgent networks in the Middle East. So the software is pulled together fragments of data that normally lived in separate systems like cell phone records, satellite imagery, travel logs, intelligence reports, and it placed them all into a single environment, making it much easier for analysts to connect the dots. On top of this, forward deployed engineers from Palantir, or FTEs as they're called, they spent months living alongside intelligence analysts in the field. Karp mandated it because he's always been very, very vocal about the use of FTEs because he believes that the software has to stay grounded in human judgment. So, in other words, you can't automate life and death decisions. By 2008, its revenue was roughly $50 million, and the following year, it got its first major private sector contract with JP Morgan. Now, initially, the software was used to combat cyber fraud, but its use quickly expanded because as a result of the 2008 financial crisis, JP Morgan was sitting on this sprawling amount of information on distressed mortgage portfolios. It was all complex, it was fragmented and very, very hard to unwind. So Palantir software helped make sense of all that chaos. Executives later credited it with saving JP Morgan hundreds of millions of dollars. In 2009, Palantir raised 90 million, and then came a story in 2010 that dramatically increased its visibility and its credibility. Because researchers at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, they used Palantir software to uncover GhostNet. This was a cyber espionage network that had infiltrated the Dalai Lama's office, foreign ministries, embassies and government agencies in more than 100 countries. The operation, no surprise, was largely traced back to China. And this was big news for Palantir. It gave the company's reputation a huge boost. But one thing you can always rely with Palantir, as you'll see as the episode goes on, is that any sliver of good news that they get is usually followed by some controversy. And in February 2011, we had some controversy. This was at the height of the WikiLeaks era. So an employee of the cybersecurity firm HB Gary was investigating the hacker collective Anonymous. Now, Anonymous retaliated by breaching HB Gary's servers and then releasing more than 50,000 internal emails to the public. And those emails were explosive because they revealed a proposed partnership between Palantir, HB Gary and other firms operating under the codename Team Themis. And its purpose was to smear WikiLeaks, which by this stage was no longer viewed by the US administration as a transparency project, but it was now being seen as a hostile actor. And Team Themis was pitched as a private sector response to a problem that the governments were legally constrained from addressing themselves. And the tactics disclosed in the email, they were aggressive and just downright dirty. They included planting false stories, investigating WikiLeaks staff and their families, smear campaigns, behind-the-scenes pressure, and digital disruption through hacks. And when the plans became public, the fallout was immediate and pretty severe. Within days, Karp issued an apology saying he was deeply sorry. Palantir cut ties with HB Gary, placed one of its engineers on administrative leave, and moved quickly to distance itself from the proposals. Karp himself insisted that Palantir had not helped develop the recommendations and did not condone them, and he reiterated his long-held position that Palantir is pro-privacy, pro-civil liberties, and only works with democratic governments. And in fairness, that claim is supported by the fact that Palantir has never sold its software to regimes like Russia or China. But the problem that I have with Karp's insistence that Palantir is pro-privacy and pro-civil liberties is that its tools enable surveillance at scale. And once deployed, how those tools are used is ultimately decided by the client, not by Palantir. So, in the end, Karp isn't just asking the public to trust him, which is a big ask in itself. He's also asking that we should trust the shadiest arms of governments, intelligence services, covert institutions, whose power depends on what the public is not allowed to see. Anyway, Palantir and Karp survived that controversy, and then its reputation got a huge boost in May 2012 when rumours spread that Palantir software had played a role in the operation that led to Osama bin Laden being located. The company, it didn't confirm or deny the claims, but of course by refusing to dismiss the rumours, Palantir reinforced its growing reputation as the company that can track down even the most elusive targets. And while the details of the bin Laden operation remain classified, it is widely believed that Palantir software was used in support of the operation. Now, 2013, it raised $440 million. Its revenue hit $450 million, and its valuation was now at $9 billion. But it still hadn't turned a profit. But its revenue kept growing year on year. Then by 2017, Peter Thiel's pretty visible support for Donald Trump had made the company kind of radioactive inside Silicon Valley. Because we got to remember, back then, all the Silicon Valley tech bros were still Democrats. Many Palantir employees, including Karp, they leaned progressive. Yet the press, they were increasingly framing the company as Thiel's company. So Karp pushed back. He gave long interviews where he talked about teaching meditation classes to employees, practicing Tai Chi with his swords in his office, and he positioned himself very differently to Thiel, this openly philosophical CEO who's steeped in critical theory, a lifelong Democrat, and definitely not a fan of Trump. Because Karp has been quoted as saying about Trump around this time, "I respect nothing about that dude. It would be hard to make up someone I find less appealing." So that's pretty clear. And Karp's positioning here, it acted as a counterweight. And yes, he does call himself progressive, but it's also important to understand where he's coming from. He believes that progress isn't about restraint, it's about strength, because without power, liberal values don't survive, they get replaced. So this philosophical view, it's baked into Palantir's mission. Karp believes progress depends on strength, and strength then depends on doing the work for government that other tech companies avoid. And that became clear in 2018 because Google had been working with the Pentagon on Project Maven. This was an AI project to analyse drone footage and to identify people and objects. But after employee protests within Google, Google pulled out, and its CEO said the company should not be in the business of war. Now, what rings kind of hollow here with Google's moral posturing is that it didn't walk away on principle. It walked away after internal backlash. Palantir happily stepped in, and Karp was blunt. He criticised Silicon Valley leaders for refusing military work, calling their stance, and I quote, borderline craven. And his argument, as I mentioned, was simple. You don't get to enjoy the protections of the state while outsourcing its defence. And for him, supporting the military is a moral obligation. And look, while Karp is at least consistent in this, his insistence that, tech companies have a moral obligation to work for the government, that's just absurd. It's totally reasonable if a company decides it doesn't want to get involved in defence work. And I think Karp is on very, very shaky ground when it comes to preaching morality, especially when we see what happens next. So this is 2018, and this is when Palantir's work with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, it moved fully into the public view. But it is worth noting that Palantir's work with ICE, it began in 2014 under the Obama administration. But in 2018, family separation became official policy. And this is when thousands of children were taken from their parents. And we're not talking just teenagers here, which would be bad enough. A lot of these children were 4, 5, 6 years old. Some were held for weeks, even months, in overcrowded detention centres. So the backlash was immediate. But Karp rejected the criticism outright. And he didn't talk about individual suffering. Instead, he framed enforcement, however unpopular, as a moral duty. And this is the pattern with Karp. He rarely engages with the human consequences of what Palantir enables. He talks about state, power, order. He speaks as the philosopher. And to be fair, he's good at it. He's smart. He's articulate. And some of his arguments are quite good, and they land even with me. I mean, one that stuck with me was his defence of ICE, where he argued that strong borders prevent the rise of the far right. As he put it, and I quote, "You have an open border, you get the far right. We saw it in Brexit, across Europe, and now in Germany." I get that argument. But what's missing again and again from Karp's pronouncements is the human cost. And look, I'm not expecting moral purity from CEOs. Power always involves trade-offs. But what troubles me is that Karp constantly frames Palantir as a moral project, while keeping morality abstract, about systems, about outcomes. not about what it looks like up close, like children being separated from their parents. An act that I think is just morally indefensible. And of course, Karp has an answer to that, and it's this. He says that empathy is manipulation, and that empathy is used to shut down clear thinking. That's BS in my opinion anyway. I think it's Karp using his intellectual, philosophical certainty to distance himself from responsibility while still claiming the moral ground. And I just don't like that at all. Anyway, okay, rant over. But while Palantir was taking the heat for its work with ICE, the 2020 pandemic gave the company some much needed and well earned positive publicity. Because the fact is, Palantir did some excellent work during COVID. Because as COVID spread, governments were flying blind. Data was scattered. Systems didn't talk to each other. Palantir was brought in to help track hospital capacity, ICU beds, like supply shortages in real time. The software showed where pressures were building before hospitals were overwhelmed. It helped coordinate vaccine rollouts across messy and incompatible systems. And the most striking example of the excellent work it did came at a global level. It worked with the World Food Programme as borders closed and supply chains collapsed. And its software helped keep food moving to some of the most vulnerable populations on the planet. And in 2020, the World Food Programme was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts, work that senior officials in the World Food Programme acknowledged had been strengthened in a meaningful way by Palantir's tools. In September 2020, Palantir floated with a market cap of 21 billion. Revenue reached 1.1 billion, up 47% year on year. But the company was still incurring huge losses. So to counteract this narrative, Karp made a public promise that the company would achieve annual revenue growth of 30% or more through to 2025. And controversially, to help them reach this target, Palantir began investing heavily in SPACs. Now, I mentioned them in my episode on Chamath Palihapitiya. SPAC stands for Special Purpose Acquisition Company. And in simple terms, it's a company that raises money first, then goes looking for a private business to merge with, taking that company public without a traditional IPO. And because of that, with SPACs, there's far less scrutiny, there's weaker disclosures, I suppose you could say more optimistic projections, and they were the flavour of the month a few years ago. Palantir invested $300 million across 14 SPACs, and the plan behind this was that Palantir would provide the capital, and in return, those companies would sign multi-year contracts to use Palantir's software. But of course, critics accused Palantir of just buying revenue. It was aggressive and risky. And the following year, the company did achieve 41% growth. So that was 2021, with revenue hitting 1.5 billion. Still incurred losses of $520 million. And on top of this, within a year, these SPAC investments, they were looking very shaky. And Palantir's share price, it was going up and down throughout 2021 as many analysts started to question whether Karp's growth pledge of 30% per year, whether it was sustainable. So it was definitely a pretty rocky time for Palantir. But then geopolitics intervened. On February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine and Karp moved immediately, offering Palantir software to Ukraine on what he described as a philanthropic basis. And in June, he became the first CEO of a major Western tech company to visit Kiev during the war, crossing the Polish border on foot and meeting President Zelensky in a fortified bunker. And there's actually photos of this. And what Palantir offered Ukraine was speed and coordination. It helped with air defense, with logistics, battlefield awareness, especially in those early phases of the war when everything was chaotic and when time really mattered most. And Palantir is rightly credited with helping Ukraine stay in the fight against a much larger enemy. And more than anything else, its involvement in Ukraine, it changed how the company was viewed because the software was now being used in an active war where lives were on the line day after day. It was the ultimate proof of Karp's and Palantir's mission. Its software was helping a Western democracy protect itself and fight against an authoritarian regime. And this is the uncomfortable truth about Palantir. You have to take the good with the bad. And you also have to acknowledge that when you strip away the politics, their software is genuinely very, very good. Better than anything else on the market. That's why Palantir's revenues keeps growing. Not just with governments, but with companies, because almost half of Palantir's revenues come from private companies. And for the most part, these companies, they're not using the software for spying on employees or hoovering up customer data. Most of that work is really, really mundane, like tracking supply chains, matching invoices to payments, spotting fraud, managing inventory, working out where projects are slipping and costs are overrunning. You see, for all the controversy, a lot of the time, Palantir is doing very, very ordinary work and just doing it better than anyone else. By the end of 2022, Palantir finally turned a profit, and revenue for that year came in at just under $2 billion, up around 24% on the previous year. So that was below the 30% target Karp had promised, because the SPAC bets hadn't worked out, but Ukraine had definitely changed the narrative. Then in 2023, Palantir launched its AI platform, and unlike a lot of the AI hype elsewhere, many of Palantir's customers went from the AI demo into deployment within weeks, not months, which is very rare for enterprise AI. And this was reflected in larger deals, expanded contracts, and as a result, revenue has increased significantly. And I guess it's no surprise in one way that the company would also prosper under the Trump administration, because you can see how they're aligned in many ways, especially on border control and national security. But it is kind of surprising when you take into account that Karp was a lifelong Democrat, although he's also been a very vocal critic of the Democrats. And also when you remember that he called Trump, one of the least appealing dudes ever. Anyway, 2025, its revenue was $4.4 billion. Roughly 55% comes from government, 45% from private companies, and 2026, its revenue is projected to reach $7.2 billion. That's more than 60% growth in a single year. The market cap at the time of recording is $375 billion, and Karp's net worth is over $13 billion. And look, from a purely business perspective, Karp has done a remarkable job. It genuinely is a mission-driven company, and he embodies that mission completely. There's plenty about Palantir's business that I am uncomfortable with, and I haven't even touched on its role in Israel and Gaza here, because that's a whole story that's probably better handled on a different type of podcast. But the reality is, there are always going to be companies like Palantir, companies that work closely with governments, and as a result, they get involved in projects that are polarizing. But even Palantir's most ardent critics would have to admit, although they probably won't admit, that the company's software has often been put to use for the greater good, like with COVID, like in the Ukraine. So it's complicated. Now, as for Karp the person, he's undeniably unconventional, and I kind of like that about him. He travels with Norwegian bodyguards. He owns 10 cross-country ski huts scattered around the world. He's never married. Described himself as geographically monogamous. That means that he maintains relationships with women in different countries. He has no desire for children. He once joked that the thought of children brings him out in hives. And according to Michael Steenberger, who wrote a biography of Karp, and I've listened to him being interviewed many times, so he knows Karp very well, Steenberger says that Karp is a very genuinely happy and content man. And look, as you know, I don't go too deep when giving my point of view about most of the people I cover. Maybe a few little digs or compliments, a bit of colour here and there. That's about the size of it. But with Karp, it's different. With Karp, I'm going to make a bit of an exception, because unlike many of the other business leaders, Karp has built Palantir as a 100% mission-driven company. His philosophy, it doesn't just influence the culture, it underpins everything the company does. And because Palantir is involved in the machinery of government power, from defence to policing, to intelligence, that makes it worth examining a little bit. So let's look at Karp's core view. So at its core, Karp's view of the world is pretty dystopian. He believes humanity has always been violent and will always be violent, and that anyone hoping for something better is naive. I don't buy that at all, and I see Karp as having this very strange contradiction, this radical optimism about technology that's paired with a near total fatalism about people. Because when you zoom out, the historical record just doesn't support that view. We've abolished slavery in most of the world. The proportion of people dying violent deaths is historically low. Human life is valued and protected in ways that would have been unthinkable for most of history. Now, that doesn't mean that violence has disappeared. It hasn't. But it does mean that moral progress is real. And the idea that our values haven't evolved, that progress is an illusion, that, in my opinion, just doesn't hold up. Now, he also believes that if liberal democracies want to survive, they need to be able to defend themselves against authoritarian states. Technology matters, power matters. And if, for example, China ends up with an overwhelming technological superiority, the consequences for us would not be good. And I definitely agree with that. But Karp doesn't stop there. He argues that it's not enough to defeat your enemies. You must humiliate them and keep them poor. And they're his words, not mine. And I quote, this is straight from Karp: "The most effective way for social change is to humiliate your enemy and make them poorer." Now look, history should make us very uncomfortable with that idea. We tried it after World War I. Remember, Germany was humiliated, economically crushed, and we all know how that ended. And look, I don't agree with Karp's ideology or his view of the world, but that on its own doesn't bother me. I mean, people can and should be able to disagree and still get on. That's healthy. What really bothers me about Karp is his certainty. And to understand what I mean, you actually have to hear him speak. I'd strongly recommend that you watch or listen to his interview with Andrew Ross Sorkin from December 2025. You'll see it on YouTube. And here's a taste. These are direct quotes. "With all respect, I am running the most important tech company in the world." Okay? This quote: "I believe that someday almost everyone in this audience is going to agree with me. You may not like me now, but you're going to agree later. That is 100% true." Now, this isn't confidence. I like confidence. This is something else. And the more I listened to Karp, not just that interview, but across other podcasts and talks, the clearer it became what was troubling me. And I don't say this lightly, but it's fanaticism. Fanatics aren't defined by passion or intelligence or ideology. They're defined by certainty without humility, by the inability to imagine that they might be wrong. And that is exactly what I get when I listen to Karp. And because Karp is a philosopher, I'll end with a quote from Bertrand Russell. "The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people so full of doubts." Anyway, I know that's heavy stuff. And look, regardless of my view of Karp, both he and Palantir, I think, make for a genuinely fascinating story. So thanks for listening, folks. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.